Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today. We're so excited to join you. We're very thankful you've invited us into your respective living room or home office or kitchen slash hallway, as you're seeing here with me. This is Groupe.io's webinar as we get our Panera delivery hanging out in the background here. This is Groupe.io's webinar, How to Overcome Adoption Challenges in Internal Communications. My name is Raj Nation. I am the brand evangelist on behalf of Groupe.io. If you want to tweet about today's webinar as we are going through the content, or if you want to post about it on LinkedIn, we invite you to do so by using hashtag #InternalComms. Again, today is how to overcome adoption challenges in internal communications, and it is brought to you by Groupe.io. What is Group? Well, tell me if this scenario sounds familiar at all. It is, you feel like your team is all over the place. You've got communication happening in one app, and you're assigning tasks in another, and you're jotting approvals on paper and pen, and at the end, it just kind of feels like you've reviewed invoices the same way 800 times, but there still isn't even a process for that. It's impossible to stay on top of everything and make sure everyone else there does their part using 7 different apps, each with their own little nuances. Working with the same people every day flat out shouldn't feel like a mess. So Groupe.io creates structure for literally anything that involves your people. You can do all the things that the other apps do, but better and in one place. So with Group, you can go from a team that's all over to a group that is in sync today. Just do that at Groupe.io, Groupe.io. Let me make sure my screen is sharing here and that you can see what I've got pulled up. I think you should, do you guys, just let me know in the chat if you see this slide here that says how to overcome adoption challenges or not. And if not, let me try that again. Show screen. Let me get this going. And now I think we should be good. No, my computer, whenever it goes to full screen, it likes to slide away to the other screen. All right, I think we're good. Now, how's that for an adoption challenge?
Good to go.
My own computer. Yeah. All right, so we've got 2 awesome panelists today for this fireside chat webinar. First, I want to introduce you. Actually, sorry, before I do that, let me just give you a quick background here on how this is going to run. I'll be doing Q&A with Blair and Caitlin, who I'll be introducing in a second here. It's going to be a really fun conversation. During this webinar, we invite you to ask questions. So in the GoToWebinar option, you can just ask questions directly in the chat box there, or in the question tab rather. We want you to be part of the conversation. As topics come up, I'll be pulling from them if the question's relevant to what we're discussing in the moment. We will also reserve time at the end for audience Q&A. And then this is the really cool thing that we're doing as well that you might not have seen on other webinars, but any questions that we don't have time to answer in this specific session today, we are going to actually, afterwards, you'll be getting a link to join a specific spot within the Groupe.io desktop platform and mobile app. And you just click that URL, you'll be able to join the spot, which is essentially the group within Group, specifically dedicated to this webinar, where you can connect with the other attendees, connect with Blair and Caitlin as well. And any of those questions didn't get answered, they'll be able to answer the questions within the spot on Groupe.io. So it's a nice way for us to just kind of carry the momentum forward, continue to stay connected, build some community around this, and make sure that you get your questions answered if there's not time on this specific session today. And then last thing, housekeeping item, is that this webinar is being recorded and it will be sent to everyone here. So love it if you're with us live today, but if you're not and you're only watching us on the recording, hello from the past, and thank you for inviting us into your future. So let's introduce our amazing panelists for today's fireside chat, starting with Blair Pleasant. Blair is the president and principal analyst at ComFusion and a co-founder of BC Strategies, formerly UC Strategies. As a communications industry analyst, she provides strategic consulting services and market analysis on business communication applications, technologies, and markets aimed at helping end user and vendor clients both strategically and tactically. Her primary areas of focus are unified communications and collaboration, contact center, and other business communication technologies. She provides clients with a variety of custom consulting services, including market analysis, surveys, research, white papers, product assessment, competitive analysis, strategic development, vendor analysis, marketing and product positioning, partner development, and more. If it has to do with communications, there's a good chance Blair can do it. And I'm sure she lives up to her last name and that the results are very pleasant for her clients. Blair is also a frequent speaker and participant in industry conferences, webinars like today's, podcasts, and other events to help educate customers, solution providers, channel partners, investors, and others about the evolving unified communications and collaboration and contact center markets. You can see on the screen Blair's blogs and articles where they can be found. And then you can also tweet if you want to tag her in any tweets you're doing at Blair Plez. Blair, thank you for joining us today.
Great to be here. Thank you.
And from Blair, we now go to Caitlin Strauss, Corda. She's senior consultant and account lead at Blue Beyond Consulting. Well, it is a management consulting firm that builds effective organizations where both the business and the people thrive, which I think is kind of a goal that we all strive for, is business and people thriving. In her role there, Caitlin focuses on the creation and delivery of effective communication strategies that align leaders, engage employees, and inspire change and adoption. Caitlin is deeply passionate about the people side of business, with expertise in employee engagement, organizational communications, culture building and activation, leadership development, organization development, and strategy development and operation, or strategy development and alignment, I should say. She helps leaders of Fortune 500 companies pinpoint the levers within their teams that will achieve the right breakthroughs at the right time and in a way that's real, practical, and centered around lasting impact. So to put it in short, when it comes to internal communications, or IC for short, Caitlin will have you saying, I see, in the most positive way possible. Caitlin, thank you for joining today.
Oh, you're welcome. Glad to be here.
Well, we're gonna have a lot of fun today, and just I mentioned myself at the beginning, but I'll kind of say it again. My name is Raj Nation. I am brand evangelist on behalf of Groupe.io, and I'm also founder of Startup Hype Man, working with fast growth companies on helping their messaging and their story stand out to their intended audience and stand apart from their competitors. With those introductions, let's get started. Now, the way we're going to do this today is going to be a series of Q&A in a fireside chat format, and we'll have specific questions designed for specific people, and then you'll both be jumping in at certain points. So Blair, I want to start with you at a high level here as we think about this topic in general. Why is user adoption important, and why should organizations be thinking about user adoption of unified communication tools?
Great way to start. Thank you. So it's really simple. Adoption leads to usage, which leads to a return on investment. That's really what it comes down to. So companies that invest in new technologies and new solutions, whether it's UC or IC or something else, they expect their workers to actually use the technology in order to get the benefits that the solutions provide. But in a lot of cases, user adoption of technologies can be as low as like 20%, in large part because either they lack training and internal marketing, or they just don't get it. So what happens is that end users may go back to the tools that they were using before and that they're more comfortable with. But what happens is that leads to shadow IT, it leads to security and compliance issues, and some other things. So what it really boils down to is, if you want to get the return on investment on the technologies that you invested in and get the value that you expected, you really do need to focus on user adoption.
Now, when we think about that, and that's a great introduction. Thank you for sharing, Blair. What do you think then the role specifically of the C-suite is in the adoption of these unified communication tools within the organization at large?
Yeah, so when it comes to influencing the adoption of new technologies, again, whether it's UC or something else, executive sponsorship is really important. So when I talk to companies about developing adoption strategies, I always encourage them to create a sponsorship team, and that team has to include some C-level executives, and also, various line of business owners, IT people, definitely the CIO, telecom managers, and also a sampling of end users. So C-level and other executives they set the example, and they drive adoption for the rest of the company. Basically leaders lead by example. So when employees see the executives and managers and others, using the new services, then they're also more likely to use it. So it's really about setting that example to drive adoption. And I've seen in cases where, there was a CEO who said, if you want to contact me, you need to do it through our video conferencing tools. So really setting the example for the rest of the employees.
So yeah, so it sounds like making sure that there is like an agreed upon way of doing things and having someone or some small group of people really drive that for everyone else to make sure they adopt and implement.
Exactly.
I think that might be a good segue, Caitlin. I want to ask you, should organizations, and maybe this will play off that idea of the executive sponsorship, but should organizations start with a top-down model or encourage two-way communication?
It's a great question. I think there's not a simple answer. I think you got to do both. I mean, I think kind of going back to what Blair said, you really have to have leaders in your organization demonstrating the right behavior that you want people, if you want that end user adoption, they really have to be on that tool, both that people can see as well as kind of championing that in things like all hands meetings, things like company meetings, on internet articles, just by way of talking about it and seeing in other places that these kinds of things are important and that we're getting airtime at kind of that top down. I think shows people that they're important and kind of giving examples of how they're being used and how they're driving better business practices and driving better outcomes for customers, for partners, for business users, kind of in that environment. On the two-way piece, I think it's also incredibly important that you're getting feedback, from your users, from your employees, that's going to influence what you learn, how you need to continue to communicate more effectively. You might have thought that a communication strategy going in was going to be the right way to do it, and you learn from your users that it just didn't land right. It just didn't make sense for whatever reason. So you've got to be really actively listening. And I think one key to that is to be sure that you've got someone, kind of on that project team, on the deployment team, whose responsibility it is to kind of watch that community, kind of how are they interacting? What are they doing? What feedback do we need to be providing back up to that sponsorship team that Blair was talking about that's going to continue to drive that adoption over time?
I want to come back to one of the things you said at the beginning of that. You said it kind of starts, at least on the top down, with leadership demonstrating the right behavior. I feel like there are instances where conceptually they get that, but then the actions don't necessarily follow. And there may be like hey, here's what you need to do, but they're just kind of like, yeah, but I'm busy kind of thing. So I guess almost from like a mindset perspective, what mindset needs to be adopted to make sure that the behaviors then follow in the right way?
It's a good question. I think the first thing that came to mind when you were talking about that, Rajiv, is just, it's almost if they're, what does it say if they're not on there? If they're absent on that platform. I think that it's one of those things that just to shift the mindset, not from, as a leader, I need to be on there, but to what does it look like if I'm not there? Because that's a signal to employees if they're not seeing their leaders of any kind, everybody from kind of that line manager to a department lead to the C-suite, and realizing that varying degree, that's not like your C-suite leader is going to be on there all the time, and on there really depends on what the tool is. But I think the mindset shift of what does it look like if I'm not there? What message is my absence sending is one way to kind of, I think about that mindset. And sometimes they just, any C-suite leader, any leader, they're busy, they need help. I think that's another place where if you've got really, you're thinking about your communication strategies and your engagement strategies, they may just need some help, kind of, a daily reminder, to kind of, to go on there. Here's your kind of, character tweet on what to put on that platform on a daily basis, or here's how to kind of engage, and just being sure someone's following up with them to help them with that until the behavior is there. Because a lot of times it's not the intent. Those people are just really busy. And even if the intent's in the right place, it can be a challenge to kind of remember all the things you have to do in one day.
Blair, before I kind of go to the next question, I'd actually love to get your opinion on that as well. When you think about sort of that like mindset shift, I love, Caitlin, what you said about what does it say about if you're not there. Blair, do you have any additional insight to add there on in terms of thinking about the mindset shift?
Yeah, and a lot of it has to do with corporate culture. And if the company doesn't see that the leaders are doing it this way, then they're just not going to. So it really comes down to, the C-suite setting the stage and saying, this is the way we're going to operate. And a lot of it is culture. It's more than technology. It's this is how we're going to be communicating and collaborating, and it's important to the company. So I think it really does change. It's not just about technology, and I think that's what companies have to really recognize. It's about the impact on communications, collaboration, and just how the company operates. So if the C-suite isn't doing it, then it's really, as Caitlin said, it's setting the stage for other people to be like, well, maybe that's not the way we should be doing things. So it really needs to be a do as I do, not just a do as I say.
Yeah. So it's really about. It sounds like it's really about like if you're trying to initiate some type of change around communication, you have to set the example for everyone else in order for it to truly be adopted and be successful in implementation.
Mm-hmm.
Blair, let's assume then that they are setting the example, and let's assume that things are changing in a good way. What are some key metrics or KPIs that best measure the adoption of unified communication tools?
Yeah, so it's important. So a lot of people just look at usage. And usage is basically about, the number of conferences or, about the quantity of service being used. Whereas adoption is really about who's using it and how is it being used. So there's really a difference between just usage and adoption that companies need to think about. So, let's take video conferencing, for example. If let's say video conferencing is being used, 100 minutes a day, but it's the same 2 people all the time that are using it and not other people in the company, then you're not getting the adoption you need. So just looking at the numbers isn't really going to tell you. So adoption is really about, who's making use of the service, how many users hosted a conference this month, how many users joined a conference, who abandoned the service. So those are some, pretty basic KPIs you can look at. But what I think is more important is looking at the business metrics that are important to your company. So when you first bought and deployed the service, what were you looking for? What were your goals? What were you looking to try to do? So did you meet your business goals and your outcomes? Did you find improvements to things like customer sat or reductions in the sales cycle or reducing the time to market? So it really comes down to what were your goals when you bought the system and did you meet those goals? So that's really how I would measure it rather than just, how many meeting minutes or, how many phone calls and things like that.
Let me ask you a follow-up to that. And I'm like, this is all great. I'm like furiously taking notes over here as you guys are talking. Why do you think there are cases that come up where like maybe they go in with like, hey, these are the metrics that we know we want to grade on, but then once usage and adoption once they start implementing it, they have the tendency sometimes to like fall back on like vanity metrics that don't actually tie back to the things that they were originally looking for? Is it like it creates a lot of effort to have to figure out what do we fix here? Is that the idea behind it, or is that the reason?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that, and some things are hard to measure. Did you meet your goals? Unless there's a hard number, it really is hard to measure that. So measuring, specific usage things like, minutes and things like that's really easy. But then when it comes to, did you improve customer satisfaction? That's a lot harder to measure. So sometimes when I engage with companies, if possible, I tell them to try to measure things before and then after so that they have that baseline. Because if you don't have that baseline to measure against, then it can be pretty tricky. But if you have an idea of what you're currently doing or what you're doing before you deploy the system or service, then you have an easier way of measuring and comparing afterwards. Or sometimes if that's hard, what I tell people to do is deploy the system to different groups. So maybe deploy it to group A, but not to group B, and then try to compare things. So do a side by side and see how the UC system has helped them, be more collaborative, and achieve some of those goals. So if they can compare 2 different groups or divisions, maybe that's one way to do it.
I'm going to turn it over to Caitlin for a second, but then I'm going to come back and ask both of you a question specifically related to that follow-up right there. So Caitlin, on the IC side, what are key metrics or KPIs that we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I think on that side, it's a lot of things. But there are some of the things that are just common, like how many likes are you getting? What's the engagement looking like? What are likes versus comments? What is the nature of those comments? How are people using it? How many people are using it? I think those are things that are more like, I consider those in a category of what to monitor less about kind of what to measure and how that relates. And I think, Blair, you said something that I think is so true, is it takes a lot of time and energy to measure the right things that are really focused on the outcomes. And I think a lot of teams going in, one of the best parts, every strategy when you deploy one of these types of things really has to have kind of its own metrics and outcomes kind of measurement thinking behind it. And I think that it's very easy to kind of set it and forget it. And it's a very active process, because if you're not bringing those numbers into almost every conversation where you're talking about what is our audience doing with this? What are they seeing? What are they thinking? How are they showing up? How are they not showing up? Again, to the point about our leaders showing up, thinking about different audiences, not just kind of peanut buttering everything as all employees, but kind of stratusing your different audiences and thinking about, what different roles are using it, or geos, business units or functions, how are they performing differently, and what might that be? And that's a long, very complex list I even just laid out to think about. And if you want to get the most out of whatever you're deploying, it does take time and part of someone's role to be looking at that and really making meaning out of that for leaders and people that are engaged in that process. And it's a very active process. And I think to make sure that somebody is really assigned to be thinking about that is incredibly important to the success of a lot of these types of deployments.
I want to remind everyone who's watching this right now, of course, you can ask questions in the questions tab if you've got questions for Blair or Caitlin. You can also use the chat box as well. If there are specific things that you're vibing with, you can kind of treat it like the internet version of like snapping at a poetry slam. If there's any sentiment that you want to echo in the chat box, please don't feel shy about that. So on either side here, whether it's unified or internal communications, Blair, what I had asked you in that follow-up before was about like sort of that like disconnect between what did we buy this for metrics wise and then the reliance on like vanity metrics from there. But on either side, Caitlin or Blair, I have to imagine there is some level or degree of like the person who's responsible for like the purchase of this and the implementation is potentially thinking like, oh no, our team isn't using this the way they're supposed to. This is reflecting poorly on me as the one who drove this, internally. And now what do I do? So I get from like a tangible level of like, oh, start looking at these metrics, but how do we get them over that hurdle of being able to see that like, it was your deal here, but you still need to like massage this and work on this to get this to be like a fully functioning machine.
Mm-hmm. I can start, and then Blair, maybe you can tag on. Would be fine. I think a couple things that come to mind is one is just this kind of age-old saying a lot of us in communications think about it as like the rule of 7. Like it just takes time. It takes 7 times of telling someone how to use something, where it is, experiencing it, using it. And you think about it, when you're tired of communicating it, that might be when people are just starting to kind of pick up on what this tool is and how to use it. So I think that's one thing to kind of keep in mind. And also just, you alluded a little bit to this, Rajiv, but I think as communicators, more and more, we have to think like marketers in a different kind of way. It's not just, you really have to think about that audience and how you're going to engage them and what kind of strategies that might help, to get their peers involved, or a champion network, or kind of ways to really ignite at a lot of different levels. Like if you think about that rule of 7, it's not just the same type of communication. It's also like multimodal and through peer-to-peer and top-down and kind of a lot of different ways. So I think just being sure you're really thinking holistically about that, I think is incredibly important.
Yeah, Caitlin definitely hit on a couple of really good points. So it's all about internal marketing. So that's one of the biggest things when you're deploying unified communications, is to have some sort of internal marketing. And I've seen companies that have done, they have posters, they turn it into gamification. They try to make it exciting, like, we're going to be getting this new unified communication service. So, come to this lunch and learn and find out what it's about, or, so it's all about internal marketing and trying to, make it exciting for people. But it's also, I mentioned earlier about getting that sponsorship team, getting people early on to be those evangelists and those cheerleaders. And it really does need to come from different facets of the organization. So not just, the IT people, but, people in HR, other end users, peers. So it really needs to come throughout the organization. So when people see, oh, I see that you're not sending emails anymore and you're using chat, or you're using video instead of using your phone, and that looks really cool. How do I do that? So it's really seeing other people in the organization, and especially peers who are doing this, and then that really helps. So it's all about internal marketing and getting that excitement up.
Yeah. Maybe just to add kind of building on that internal marketing piece a little bit, Blair, I think that the storytelling is also really important in that. When you start to get, enough kind of examples of how this is really working well, and this tool is really amazing, or I'm on this social network and here are some of the experiences that I've had on it, and trying to kind of grab those stories and then get them told in a way, again, if it's at an all hands meeting, or if it's a different kind of leader that's not just your IT lead, talking about how great this new deployment was, this new set of UCC tools, this new kind of social networking tool, whatever the case is, and talking about, I think, also the connection to the business, how this tool is really enabling us to move our business forward, and what we're able to do today that we weren't able to do, that's really helping our customers or propel a certain area, but to take it out of kind of the context of it's just a tool, and to put it in the context of how it's really helping our business move forward, to show kind of the end result of that. I think it's also another great way to kind of market and really kind of change the mindset on a lot of these things.
Actually, I want to build on that, because you said something really important about showing how it's important to the company. But I think what's even more important is showing how it's helpful to the individual user. I always talk about the what's in it for me. The users have to know, how is it going to make them more productive and effective? How is it going to help them do their jobs better? So always focus on not just the how to do something, but the why. Why is it going to make me more effective and productive and make my life better?
Absolutely.
This anecdotally, this reminds me of a personal story, which it's crazy because it never hit me until hearing you both talk about this, and how things can be rolled out internally. A company I used to work at, it wasn't communication software, but the same logic and lesson can be applied here. We were implementing a new software, just generally speaking, and I was like bottom of the totem pole at this company, like entry-level employee, but myself along with like 5 other people, probably like 2 other entry level and then 2 or 3 mid-level, we're all like handpicked to be like just the first users of this before it was actually announced to anyone else. And so we probably were working within it every day for like a month or 2 months by the time they rolled it out. And as part of the rollout, me, bottom of the totem pole at the company, got to like do a demo and presentation for a good portion of the company internally. And I had all this excitement because it was like, oh, I know this thing that no one else knows about yet, and I get to teach them about it. And so I'm coming to it with a lot of excitement as a user of it, as opposed to just executive level being like, hey, we bought this thing, start using it.
Yeah, I think what you just talked about, Rajiv, is so important. It's that kind of change champion network, or a, kind of a early adoption user group. There's a lot of different flavors of how you can call that, but finding kind of a few key people, and really also thinking about like the demographics of that group, being sure that there's some people from different parts of the organization, a diverse group of people that are really looking at this from a lot of different angles, and kind of getting their feedback. Really, like, that's of course just the best practice, but I love what you said about giving them that experience of also being able to share that knowledge with other people, because I think that's such a great way to kind of, as another employee, as a fellow employee, as a fellow individual contributor, as a manager, as a, name your role, to be able to kind of hear from the users that are using it, that are kind of a little bit ahead. And also, I think down the road, being able to use that same Change Champions network as a bit of kind of a, as their new features, or as there's kind of like, you just have those people who are already in it who can be kind of, a little bit more active, and they're also a great group from a communication standpoint to deploy things through. If you kind of want to ignite something, share something, make sure we're getting more activity, and getting opinions and feedback and stuff like that also.
Right. I want to actually, Caitlin, I want to follow up with you with a question we've got in the chat here, and that is kind of building off this idea of the internal marketing concept. What are your thoughts on developing user personas for like specific like groups of employees to be able to craft targeted messages towards them? And and then in line with that, what are some like variables or demographics or psychographics to look at within that?
Good question. It's definitely something we've done quite a bit, at Blue Beyond. And you think about like, what are the different, personas? What do they need to know? What are the questions that are on their minds? What does their day-to-day look like? And some of the dimensions we think about are, there's a couple different ones. You might have kind of your early adopters, mid adopters, late adopters is kind of one way to think about it. You also might have role-based, which is, individual contributor, manager of managers, leader, geo role, BU function. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to think about it based on kind of what is the tool, what are the outcomes you're looking to achieve, and kind of how you want to kind of deploy. But I think it's a really important thing to think about, because there's a lot of different audiences within the audience of your company, of all of your employees. There's just a lot of different dimensions to think about. And I think it really picking the right dimensions or the right personas to focus on, because you can't boil the ocean. You could cross-cut that list I just said a million different ways. It's really going back to the outcomes and kind of what's the purpose of what you're trying to deploy. What is the most important group to kind of get engaged there first? I think of a lot of the social tools. It's really important to have the people managers on there, because or the leaders, because if they're not, that's not going to drive the right behaviors. There's a lot of different ways to think about that for a lot of the other tool suites too. So.
It sounds like, which I 100% agree with, because I do a lot of work in customer facing messaging, and it sounds like it's very similar to that, which is value. Like how are you showcasing value for this user group or this target audience, as opposed to bogging them down with product details.
Absolutely.
Blair, or Blair or Caitlin, actually, here's another question we got in the chat. What are your recommendations when we think about regarding to increasing communication engagement at a large organization like 10,000 people plus, when you've got multiple quote unquote like communicators, and they're also encouraging adoption of like their own priorities? And something to think about here would be like when you think about their specific messages, you've got like messages from the project level, from the leadership level, from the change management level. How do we think about increasing engagement internally and adoption when you've got like almost like multiple stakeholders trying to also get their own message out there?
Yeah, so trying to prioritize and figure out what really takes priority can be difficult. So again, I think part of it is coming down from the C-level. This is a priority and this is something that we're going to be doing. But when it comes to UC and collaboration, it really is a company-wide endeavor, because like with collaboration, I always talk about, if you don't have enough people collaborating, it's kind of like one hand clapping. You need to have that, that mass group, because if your entire group isn't collaborating together and you've got just a couple people doing it, then you're really defeating the purpose. So I think it really is important to get that, at least, the group of people that you're working with, on board and with that. So, maybe different groups in the organization, other divisions or other roles maybe can be focusing on something different. But I think if this is important for your group, then it really is important for everybody in the group to be doing it. So that needs to take a priority.
Caitlin, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think it's also, I think what Blair said is spot on. And I also think that it's thinking about the who in the organization is doing a lot of the communication. I mean, there's a lot that's always coming out from internal communications, IT, HR, certainly the business and functional units, but those three functions drive a lot of kind of the activity of communication across the company, and being sure those functions are talking together. If there's a communications council where at least once a month, or like pick your right cadence, where there's kind of an alignment of kind of leadership and what are the most important messages that we need to get across, and thinking about, there's a lot, gosh, if you think about, there's a ton of just regular communications around benefits or performance management or just those kinds of things, let alone I think some of the kind of the tools that we're focusing on here, and how do all of those groups talk to one another to kind of decide what's the calendar of communications and how we're going to deploy that. And to the degree there's kind of some ability to to streamline some of that, or to share and kind of cross-pollinate some messaging at that top level in a lot of those forums, I think is incredibly important. And just really trying to get aligned and kind of having a mechanism to flight direct a little bit, and to help people kind of know, to help separate some noise from the songbook a little bit.
I want to come back to something we were talking about earlier, which was the idea of like organizational culture was brought up, and how there has to be like a cultural shift towards this, and it has to be part of the culture, right? So what would you say, I guess, to what degree does organizational culture contribute to the success or failure? And even more than that, if you have a specific like client example of like the culture here was, it was like this, and here's how things were implemented, that would be great if you're able to speak to that. Blair, I'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah, so when it comes to UC and collaboration, it really does represent a huge shift in the way people work and the way companies do business. So when companies are deploying UC, they have to recognize that it's not just about technology. It really is a new way of working. And collaboration doesn't just happen. Workers need to understand best practices. They need to understand when and how to use these tools. So if you're adding collaboration capabilities, the corporate culture or the company culture really needs to prioritize collaboration and not just independent work. I've heard about companies that have changed the way they compensate people, that things are based on group projects and results rather than just your individual. So like bonuses might be based on the way you collaborate together and the way a project comes together. So it really is important for companies to prioritize collaboration and to really show workers why it's important, and again, as I said before, the what's in it for me, but so how it's going to affect your work, but that has to be part of the corporate culture. It's saying that we are a collaborative culture. So what happened when UC was first deployed, people had to turn on their presence settings, away, available, whatever, and people were freaking out by that. They were like, I don't want my boss or coworkers to know, that out to lunch or I'm away from my office or whatever. So it really did take that cultural change to make it be like, it's okay, and this is the way we're all working, and we have to be respectful. Like if someone has do not disturb or presence, in a meeting or whatever, don't call me. I'm busy. So a lot of it has to be respect the way people are working, and so again, that's a cultural thing. You can't just walk into someone's office and interrupt them when they're on the phone. And the same goes for when you're using UC in collaboration. If I say that I'm on a call, don't disturb me. Don't be sending me a zillion requests to do something. So it really is important to, again, lead from the top and show how it's important. And use these examples, use video to make interactions more personable and more personal and fun. So showing how it's going to affect everybody, and it has to come from the top if it is going to be that kind of cultural change.
Let me just ask a follow-up to that, Caitlin, before I get your input. Blair, I think earlier on you mentioned like, hey, like gamification is one way to help drive these things internally. I think, which I think is a great strategy. When I think about culture, I think it's possible for an organization to say like, oh, well, we're not the kind of company that does gamification. So my follow-up question here is it more important to be like, well, this is what's in line with how our culture is, or is it more, should you kind of be more like, well, we need to be headed in this direction with our culture, and therefore we could do something that is a little bit uncomfortable from what we maybe traditionally have done?
Well, if gamification doesn't really fit with your type of company and your workers, then don't do gamification. But there are other things that you can do. So maybe push the limits a little bit, but not too much out of your comfort zone. Like for a lot of companies, as I said before, they've been using posters and things like that. So maybe start with something a little simpler and something a little more basic. And you don't have to push the envelope too far. But I think it is important to test the limits a little bit, see what your workers are open to, because just because you haven't done it before doesn't mean people aren't open to it, and it may not be a good way to go forward.
Yeah, just because it hasn't been done doesn't mean it can't be done.
Yeah,
Um,
but don't
Caitlin, I want
maybe
to get
do
your
it all
input
at
then
once. Do
overall.
it
Sorry,
gradually.
go ahead, Blair. Sorry, I cut you off there accidentally. Blair, say that again.
No, I was just saying, maybe you don't want to do everything all at once. You might want to just introduce things a little gradually.
Got it.
Mhm.
Caitlin, I want to hear what you have to build off of that in terms of culture impacting success or failure of adoption and
Yeah,
implementation.
yeah. I mean, when I think about culture, we think about culture in organizations. I really think about it. It's what makes us us. It's kind of who we are at our essence. What makes us us. And that shows up in so many different ways, right? Like it shows up in our day-to-day interactions. It shows up in leadership behaviors, and all the way down through the company. It shows up in the stories and the lore that we tell ourselves kind of about the history of the company. And a lot of times when you think about that, like there's a conversation about, gosh, remember when we implemented that, kind of CRM software, this thing, that thing, like those types of things are kind of part of that lore. When you had your first customer, when this first thing happened, and when you implement that, a lot of that is built into there, as well as kind of the tools and processes. That is also one of the things that makes us us. And I think that thinking about when you deploy or when you launch and when you sustain and grow a lot of these things, like that is where people are every day. And so those are real culture creating moments, and they're real culture creating places where I think your culture either kind of stays the same, it kind of accelerates a lot of the things that you're hoping to develop, hopefully in a good direction, or it can kind of degrade if it's just not a place that's kind of being kind of constantly and consistently watered and thought about, and kind of with the right things. So I think, you were mentioning something, Blair, that kind of got me thinking about, with the gamification, and maybe that's not kind of in your culture wheelhouse yet. But I think some things that like I see a lot of these implementations as an opportunity to accelerate culture growth, or to accelerate towards a more aspirational state that you want your employees to go towards. If you want them to be collaborating more, you want them to be engaging more at an individual level, particularly now where, we're all of a sudden finding folks it's going to be a long time. So we're, probably all back in the office in the way that we once knew it. So these tools are going to be even more important when it comes to culture and kind of how we're showing up and how we're interacting with each other. And even if they're not quite in the place that, our culture might not meet the, it might not be kind of where we, not where we need it to be, but we are having these moments through, our virtual interaction to kind of put that towards that aspirational state and kind of engage in a different way, and we'll, create those connections as well. So
I have a homework assignment now for everyone on this webinar, and that is you have to write at the top of your blank sheet of paper, what makes us us, with a question mark, draw a line underneath it, and then write down all the bullet point answers or paragraphs you come up with. I really like that question. What makes us us? I would be remiss if I didn't ask any question related to challenges due to stay-at-home order, everyone working from home, remote work policies. Now, I'll tell you this, from a communications perspective, I'm sick of, at this point, hearing the phrase now more than ever, in these uncertain times, and in these crazy times, or whatever the other one is.
Don't forget the new normal.
Oh yeah,
new normal.
sorry, yeah, the
Yeah,
new normal, yeah, new normal.
I'm gonna get a T-shirt.
That would be nice, yeah. The new normal, just on the T-shirt. So let me ask a question, dropping all of those phrases in at once. So in these uncertain times, I feel like now more than ever, there needs to be an emphasis on adapting to the new normal. What I'm getting at here is what additional measures need to be taken place, or need to be put in place, I should say, because of a, generally speaking, more distributed workplace than people may be used to originally.
Yeah, so definitely when it comes to UC, I think, well, for one thing, UC and collaboration people are really recognizing the value of it, because without it, it would be really, really hard to be communicating. This is, everyone is, using Zoom or whatever, different video, they're using Slack and, different ways of collaborating. So I think the value of these tools and technologies has really come to the forefront. The problem is for people who haven't used it before, it might have been deployed in the company, but not everybody was using it. Now they really have to use it. So it's not really a question of should we adopt it or whatever. It's okay, you've got to use these tools now. It's the way we have to be doing things. So this really shows the need for training. So for a lot of people who haven't been trained on it, it's like, okay, you've got to do it now. And I've been hearing a lot of stories about internal help desks that have just been overwhelmed because people are sent home, they're told, okay, starting tomorrow, you have to use these tools, and they don't know how to do it. So they're really, they're calling to their help desks, and so it's taking a long time, and they're not necessarily getting the help that they need. So now more than ever in these uncertain times, it's really important to have, the tools to, training materials, online training materials. You can't do lunch and learns anymore. You can't do, in classroom training anymore. So you have to have online training. You have to have FAQs, maybe, communities, and ways for people to say, hey, I, got stuck on, how to do this, or I don't know how to do that. Can anyone help me? So those internal communities become really, really important. But the need for training is just really highlighted right now, I think.
Caitlin, let me ask you actually a different follow-up based off of what Blair just said on the UC side. So I think, Blair, kind of what you highlighted is that we didn't have a choice, right? Like, company didn't have a choice. They just had to adopt like overnight, which means it was a mess for a lot of companies. So Caitlin, what I'll ask you instead is like, given what Blair just said, is there still room to think about, like, okay, what do we want the next 12 months or the next 8 months to look like? And how do we almost like massage this in with whatever other tools are going to be added on? How do we like go about that now? Is there still room, or did everyone just like get like that 1 week window to make it happen? And if it didn't happen, then they just have to be in like recovery troubleshoot mode. Is there still room to be proactive moving forward?
I think there has to be room for that. I mean, I think there's, I think one thing to really look at that I would find interesting, that it's almost a must look at, is to kind of look at the populations within your teams that are using it and who isn't. And is there a way to kind of say, like, is there a group that's kind of being left behind? Is it a BU? Is it a function? Is it a certain kind of role? Is it a certain, demographic of people, either kind of, younger, older, middle age, like, and there might not be a rhyme or reason, but I don't think it's good enough to say if you miss the jump and you're not on these tools and we're a couple weeks in, then that's fair, because people have different ways of learning. People have different roles in the company. And I think just to be sure that you're not missing people and missing populations who are, by the way, going to be really important to your success as a company and as a business, just, being sure that there's, no one kind of left behind. And to the degree that there is, trying to figure out, kind of understanding what the challenges are, and where that's coming from, and doing some deep listening around that, I think is going to be hugely important, I think, in this time.
Let's transition. We've done our pandemic, our required pandemic period here of the webinar. Checking the box. Yes, we have adapted to the new normal, or talk about the new normal. Blair, I want to know from you, at a specific like technology level, what are UC technologies that you found to be the easiest to adopt, and then conversely, what are the most complicated?
Yeah, I don't think there's a general answer to this. A few months ago, before this crazy time, I would have said, video maybe is harder to adopt. But now, everyone's grandmother is using video. Everyone is using video. So things have really changed. And, by now, everyone's used to using instant messaging and chat. But when it was first introduced, there was a lot of resistance, as I mentioned earlier. People didn't want to have their present status available to people. They felt it was intrusive. And now, everyone uses it. It's just the way we communicate. So I don't know what I'd say is maybe the most hard or the most complicated to adopt, but we do see the least usage. I can talk about where we see the least usage is with the UC mobile app. Every UC vendor has, a mobile app that's on the phone, and you can, do everything do most of the things on the mobile app that you can do on your desktop or laptop. But not too many people use that, and people just tend to use their cell phone without the UC client, because that UC client adds an extra step. So I would say that's where I see the least usage. But it really comes down to how useful and intuitive the technology is. If it's hard to use and if it requires a lot of training, then it's just not going to be adopted. So if it's easy, if it's intuitive and it provides benefits and people can see the benefits, then it's going to be adopted.
That's brings up another anecdote I want to share. When you bring that notion of like, how would people naturally use this? Because I think that's like a question that gets often overlooked. Because we're just like, oh, we gave them this thing, so they're going to use it. Unrelated example, but I recall, a previous company I was working at, we were building like digital campaigns for companies, and oftentimes, the brand would be like, hey, so we want our customers, like, it's March Madness, so we want to have like our brand March Madness bracket. And we had to push back and be like, why would they use your March Madness bracket if they have their own that they're already filling out on like CBS or Yahoo that is actually with their friends already? They don't have to like convince everyone to go to this thing now. I feel like the logic kind of applies there. It's like, just because you threw like your brand on it doesn't mean that people are gonna flock to it if they already have something that's like, is like this makes sense for me. And the only incentive to go to the brand one was like, well, but then you see our logo. It's like there's got to be something more than just seeing their logo is the differentiator. Caitlin, anything you want to add there, at least on the IC side, from specific technologies around adoption or that are complicated?
I mean, I think that the one thing that was coming up for me that might not be entirely related to that, but it's like there's almost like this kind of over adoption right now of Zoom and of those kind of tools, or not, Zoom video platform, like name your choice, right? And I think there's definitely, it's almost like there's a user fatigue of those. I think some of the statistics and some of the metrics and things that I know we're working with clients to look at is kind of like, how much time are people spending on that? What does that do to culture? What does that do, if you've got, people are in meetings all of a sudden more than they were before, which is curious because everybody now has to collaborate in this way, and you can actually see more of those metrics. And what does that do or mean for culture, and how can you kind of establish some norms or communicate about that in a way that actually helps people cope with some of those things? I think is just an interesting dimension that's very different than where we've found ourselves before. I mean, there's always been this case of folks who are in a lot of meetings, but how do we help with more asynchronous communication over different kinds of platforms? People are in situations where they can work a lot more, in air quotes, because a lot of us are home, so what does that look like, and kind of how it's almost like an over adoption in some places, not because it's bad or wrong, it's just that's where we find ourselves, and what does that look like, and how do we have to help people through that too? I think is really important.
Yeah, just yesterday I got an invitation for I needed to have a call with somebody, and he sent me a conference bridge number, but an audio conference bridge number. Is like, oh my God, I'm not doing a video conference. I couldn't remember the last time that happened when I wasn't doing a video call.
Yeah, it's like you're happy just for that phone call these days. I know I feel the same way, and trying to decide, gosh, which meetings am I going to be on camera for, and which ones am I not? Because there actually is, it's important to be able to like walk around, and there's kind of this pressure, I think, to be present and to be here and to be and there's so much screen sharing, and there's just and I get really excited when I see just a phone call these days too, Blair. I totally agree with that.
Who would have thought that would be the case? I had an instance yesterday morning actually where a client emailed me and said, they were like, the fiber optic line was being worked on outside the house on the street, and so he was like, so I can't do a video call today. And in my head, I'm like, oh, the meeting's canceled. But then the next paragraph was, so just call my cell phone. And I was like, oh yeah, I didn't think of that.
Right. Oh yeah, those things. Indeed.
That does still work. So we're getting towards the end here. I want to just get our audience in with a couple questions that they had. The first one, let me pull it up here, is from Partha Sarathi, if I'm saying that right. Her question is, how can customer success managers enhance adoption right from the beginning?
So for me, it's about, again, understanding what you're trying to accomplish, what the goals and outcomes are, and then related to, this is what we're as a business trying to accomplish, and this is how it's going to help the business. And as I said, a couple times, it's what's in it for me. How is it going to help you as an individual, as a worker? So crafting that story about how it's going to help the individual worker, I think is really the first step. So understanding, what you're trying to accomplish and how it's going to help the company and the individual.
Yeah, I'd say building on exactly that, because I would 100% underscore what you just said, Blair. It's also just making sure there's a place for people to find that information. I mean, it sounds really simple, but just being sure there's the intranet landing page that has exactly the information that Blair just said, that's got links to other resources or stories, or just that story is clear and it's written somewhere that people can actually find it and search for it in the ways that make sense for your organization. Kind of all of those kind of FAQs and how to download and where to troubleshoot, and kind of that ongoing list of FAQs, et cetera, just to be sure that there's actually like a home base for that, and you're consistently pointing people back there as you're doing more communication about that, as things kind of come up, and as you're learning as you go.
It's make it easy and make it fun.
Mm-hmm.
Make it easy, make it fun. Simple enough. I like that. We've got a question from Jessica here asking about what role does change management play in adoption? And she said, i.e. the ADKAR model. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but what, if you are, then what role does change management play? And that's the example that you gave, ADKAR.
Yeah, I mean, I think about in terms of like thinking there, getting there, and living there is kind of a framework that I use in thinking about, for someone to adopt something, you first have to help them like think about what that's going to be like, whether that's a day or a month or whatever. Like, what is it? I got to think about, okay, where is this? I got to do this. And then they are kind of getting there. Okay, we're getting on the tools, we're starting to use it. Things are kind of moving in the right direction. And then all of a sudden you kind of get to the other end, and we're living in that space now, where it's almost like an afterthought. We're kind of breathing into this tool. It's kind of almost faded into the background, because it's the way that we work, and thinking about what you might need to do at some of those phases from a communications or an implementation standpoint can be really helpful at just different stages of that journey.
Right. Blair, any input on that one?
Yeah, I think it's, don't throw out too much at one time if possible. Maybe do things a little gradually so people have time to adapt to the changes, and that they're not being too overwhelmed. So setting the stage beforehand, again, helping people before you deploy the system understand what's coming so that they can get ready for it. And when it comes to training, I always talk about doing training before, during, and after. And the same really goes for that internal marketing. Get people prepared for it. Don't just throw it out there. And then when it is out there, have the FAQs, have the information, and have that ongoing. Have online videos, have those online FAQs. Have the internal communities. So preparing people for it to happen, and then helping them through the process as it happens, I think is important.
Yeah. If there's at a very basic level, there's one thing I can add. It's just almost like thinking about, for yourself personally, what are the things that overwhelm me when I'm asked to like do something new? And then you can kind of start to think about how the people actually think versus how you want to make them think. We are out of time, but let's do one quick thing here before we do that. I'm going to bring my screen back up here, and hopefully it is visible for everybody. So like we mentioned, questions that didn't get answered here, we are going to be dropping into the Groupe.io platform. So all you have to do as an audience member is type this URL into your browser, www.group, that's with an E, group.io/adoption-challenge, group.io/adoption-challenge. What we've done is create a spot, which is like a mini workspace within the Group platform, specifically dedicated to this conversation, where you can connect with Blair and Caitlin. You can also connect with each other, and any follow-up questions will be answered there over the next few days. With that said, I'm really looking forward to seeing what kind of engagement and conversations we get coming out of this. This was a ton of fun. I thank you both for your knowledge and expertise and your witticisms and being cool with having the work from home webinar thing take place. The last thing I just want to throw out there or ask as we wrap up here is I'll ask each of you. Well, Caitlin, I'll start with you, and then we'll go to Blair. With everything that we talked about today, what is just the top 1 or 2 things that you want people to take away from today's conversation?
I think it's focus on purpose. I mean, what is the purpose of kind of the tool, the deployment, the whatever it is that you've got. Make sure that that's really clear. Make sure that you're communicating that purpose, throughout your audiences. And I think the second thing would be, being sure that there's kind of that top down and that bottom up communication. I think those are two really important things to think about.
Blair, top one or two lessons or takeaways?
Yeah, it's things that I've kind of reiterated too many times, but it's not about technology. It's about, what it means to the user and the organization. And then make it easy and make it fun.
There you go.
She is Blair Pleasant. She is Caitlin Strauss Corda. I am Rajiv Nathan, aka Raj Nation, and you have been watching Groupe.io's How to Overcome Adoption Challenges in Internal Communications. We will see you over on the spot within Group. Again, the webinar, or excuse me, the URL is Groupe, GROUPE.io/adoption-challenge. Blair and Caitlin, thank you so much for your time today. This has been wonderful, and I hope you've gotten something out of it as well.
Thank you.
Indeed. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Stay safe.
Have a good weekend, everybody, and stay safe in these uncertain times of the new normal.